now we have Sally Wainwright from Scotland. Sally is the founder and director of Audacious Women Festival, which takes place in Edinburgh every February. She's a member of Women Speak Scotland, which campaigns for women's sex-based rights, and also the joint Scotland Country Contact for Women's Human Rights campaign. She's going to talk about Scotland's government is now frighteningly woke, and she's going to outline the main battlefronts, including planned legislative changes, prisons, and self-ID by stealth. So thank you for coming, Sally, and over to you.
I've called this talk Women's Rights in Scotland, but actually by the time I finished speaking, you might think that it would have been more accurate to describe it as trans rights in Scotland and the attack on women's rights. There's so many battlegrounds that it's actually quite difficult to keep up with them all. It's quite likely by the time this seminar's finished, something more will have happened. But just before I get on to talking about the sort of politics, I thought, if I may, I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to look at some geography, because I know that some of my English colleagues get a bit confused about the position of Scotland, and so I'm sure for women from elsewhere that will also be true. So there's 4 countries in the United Kingdom: Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. And there's 4 separate parliaments as well. Now, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all have devolved parliaments which have a limited degree of competency over areas of domestic law. Westminster makes law both for England and also UK-wide law for things like foreign policy or immigration, fiscal policy, and so on. And this is very important for women in Scotland because Westminster retains control over both abortion and equal opportunities. And crucially, the 2010 Equality Act is reserved to Westminster. And it's this law which offers women the protections on the basis of our sex-based rights. At present, there's a Conservative government in Westminster, and the Conservatives are the only mainstream party which hasn't drunk the Kool-Aid. And so they're not particularly inclined to pander to gender ideology, which is completely different in Scotland, where I think that the legal existence of women is increasingly dependent on the Equality Act. The Scottish National Party, which is the main party of government, is largely captured. Now, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, seems to have lost all her critical faculties on this issue, if you ask me. Although she claims to be feminist to my fingertips, she refuses to engage in any discussion with us, but said a few days ago that women's concerns are not valid, and that's pretty well her final word on the issue. In May, the SNP lost its majority, and the situation actually got worse at that point because they've now formed a coalition with the Scottish Green Party. And the Greens are at the forefront of the political demands for increased trans rights. So it's worrying that the Greens co-leaders both became government ministers under the coalition agreement. One of them, Patrick Harvey, is a particularly unpleasant man, likens women's rights organisations to terrorists, calls us far-right bigots and transphobes, and claimed in Parliament that we're funded by American fundamentalists. I have to say, I just wish they'd put that cheque in the post sometime soon, because we could certainly use some cash. Looking a little bit about what the SNP agreement covers. The first thing in their agreement is reform of the Gender Recognition Act. Now, this is a country which has just come through a global pandemic, has some of the worst education outcomes for children in Europe, and yet the main priority is to reform the Gender Recognition Act. Unfortunately, gender recognition seems to be an exception to Westminster's jurisdiction over equalities, and it looks like the Scottish Government can amend the law in this respect in Scotland. Under the existing legislation, somebody has to have lived in their acquired gender, whatever that means, for 2 years and have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria before they can get a gender recognition certificate, which lets them change their legal sex. The GRA reform bill will instead introduce self-ID. It reduces the time period for living in the acquired gender to 3 months and removes any requirement for medical diagnosis. Now, given that the GRA was actually introduced to allow a tiny number of people with severe gender dysphoria to have a so-called heterosexual marriage, because the government at the time wasn't willing to allow same-sex marriages. But same-sex marriage has been legal since 2014, at least in Scotland, I'm not sure when in England. And so the justification for the GRA actually no longer exists. So it's rather strange. Why is there this obsession with it? And I think this is the obsession with reforming the GRA is really quite sinister. Because once any man can declare himself a woman and get the legal documentation to prove it, all protection for women will effectively cease to exist. So the second part of the agreement is to bring forward legislation to implement a ban on conversion therapy in Scotland. We haven't seen the proposals yet, but I think that what they call conversion therapy is likely to be what you and I might call good practice, simply sitting down and talking to someone about what's brought them to this decision. For adolescent girls particularly, we know that very often, far too often, that includes experience of physical and sexual abuse and bullying and often autism as well. So in fact, what's called a ban on conversion therapy will likely make it very difficult for doctors to refuse to prescribe puberty blockers or wrong sex hormones, which, as far as I'm concerned, is actually an extreme form of conversion therapy. And the last key point in their agreement, or key from our perspective, is to introduce world-leading human rights legislation providing equal access to those rights for everyone, including LGBTI, alphabet people. Again, we haven't yet seen these proposals, but trans-identified people in Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, are already in a very strong position legally. They've got all the normal human rights, and in addition, the Equality Act fully protects people with the characteristic of gender reassignment. And that doesn't just include people who've transitioned, but even those who are starting the process or who have only just started to decide that they're going to start the process. So the question for me is, what more do they want? Well, firstly, I think the gender ideology extremists want to see transgender rights extended to all genders, including non-binary, gender fluid, two-spirit, and all the other 78 or however many it is genders that they've discovered so far. And this, of course, would vastly increase the risks to women. And the problem, as I see it, isn't a desire or a need for more trans rights, because they already exist. In reality, the gender ideologues want men to be given women's rights, and particularly the right to access women's spaces. Even before the coalition agreement, women's rights were being eroded almost faster than we can count. The Scottish government has promoted what I would call self-ID by stealth for some years. Actually, I think if they could, they would probably remove all protections on the basis of sex and replace it with gender. So thank goodness for the Equality Act. And I have to admit, I never ever thought that I would say this. Thank goodness for the Tories at Westminster and for the Union. Some of you may well know that, there's been a big independence movement in Scotland, and until recently, I was certainly a very strong supporter of that. But now I'm not really sure that women would survive it. And I'm certainly, if there was a referendum tomorrow, I wouldn't rush out and vote for independence with the situation as it is. So just to look at some of what's been happening, data and the loss of integrity of data is a big problem and getting worse as time goes on. So in 2019, Scotland's chief statistician issued guidance saying that in almost all cases, data should be collected according to gender and not sex. Not even both, which, to be honest, would have been quite useful, but just gender. Last month, the National Records of Scotland said that it will allow sex self-ID in next year's census. But this ignores both legal precedent and expert advice, and is despite the fact that a similar move in relation to the English census last March was ruled illegal. Still, we've got a way to go before next March, so I think you can expect to see some challenges coming up. The Scottish Government's also very keen to expand the definition of what it means to be a woman. In 2018, they passed a law requiring gender balance on the boards of public bodies. This was generally seen as a good thing, at least until it became clear that any male who self-IDs as a woman would be included. One bright politician, SNP politician, agreed that a board made up of 50% men and 50% trans women, i.e. men, that would be gender balanced. And she wasn't joking either. The Organisation for Women Scotland has challenged this at judicial review. And during that hearing, the government's advocate claimed that the move was consistent with government policy that being a woman is a matter of self-determination. Well, I have to say this policy was news to us, and it appears to have absolutely no basis in law. Unfortunately for women, Scotland lost, but they've got an appeal which is due to be heard in court next month. So yet again, watch this space. Earlier this year, the Scottish Government introduced new hate crime legislation. This makes it an aggravated offence, which basically leads to a longer sentence, if it involves prejudice on the basis of age, disability, race, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, or differences in sexual development. Strangely enough, sex is missing from the Act. But transgender identity, I'm sure you'll be delighted to know, specifically includes cross-dressing. So just to be absolutely clear, if a man wears a dress to go to a fancy dress party and he's never worn a dress in his life before or ever again, he's covered by the legislation. But if a woman is attacked wearing the exact same dress, she's not covered by it. Police Scotland is the organisation that covers the whole of Scotland. There used to be separate police boards in different locations, but there's only one now. And that records now criminals on the basis of their self-declared gender, which means that rape, which by law in Scotland requires penetration with a penis, sexual assaults and extreme pornographic offences are now being recorded as crimes committed by females. In Scotland, as I think is probably true pretty well everywhere, very, very few women are convicted of any violent or sexual offences. So there will be a serious distortion of the figures, and that has obviously knock-on effects on policy and crime prevention. In 2014, the Scottish Prison Service brought in a policy which states that prisoners should be allocated according to their self-declared gender ID, meaning men can be placed in women's prisons with no need for surgery or hormone treatment. Now, it subsequently turned out that the policy was written by James Morton, a woman, of the Scottish Trans Alliance, in consultation with trans prisoners and pro-trans organisations. Not a single female prisoner or women's organisation was consulted, and sex was not included when they were considering who would be potentially affected by the policy. Morton later revealed that the Trans Alliance targeted the prison service because they thought that if they could persuade the SPS to treat men as women in those very confined quarters, then they could get all public authorities to follow suit. That's a really scary thought, if you ask me, but I also think that maybe we need to learn something from their strategizing. A planned review of the SPS policy is already 2 years overdue, and there's still no sign of it starting. They keep saying they're going to start it, but there's been absolutely no sign of it yet. The male violence against women sector is also becoming increasingly trans-inclusive. Part of this is because the Scottish Government rules for funding organisations working in the sector requires them to ensure that your service is inclusive to lesbian, bisexual, trans and intersex women. An LBTI inclusion plan should be submitted along with your application. Now, I think that that doesn't necessarily require that services be mixed, that organisations could provide separate services for men who claim to be women, but it's generally not seen as that. Earlier this year, Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre decided to go one step further, and they've now appointed a man as its CEO, although the post was advertised as only open to women. He's been speaking out a lot recently, and in his speaking out and his trainings that he's doing for other rape crisis centres throughout the UK, he's making it increasingly clear that his agenda is both self-serving and entirely focused on trans-identified males like himself, their right to be in women's safest spaces, and their rights to have their needs, or specifically his needs, put above those of the women who are supposed to be the users of the service that he's in charge of. Women Speak Scotland, which is one of the organisations I'm involved with, has been corresponding with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, who oversee the implementation of the Equality Act, about what's been going on in Edinburgh Rape Crisis. So far, they say that they're satisfied with the assurances that Edinburgh Rape Crisis has given. I have to say we're not. But this week they did concede, and I think it's quite an important concession, that they need to review the implementation of women-only jobs, what happens when jobs are advertised as women-only, because in Scotland we're seeing an increasing number of organisations saying this job can only be filled by a woman, and that includes trans women, people who are non-binary, gender fluid, and in one case, anybody who feels comfortable working in a space which centres women. I claim that as a small step towards victory, but our correspondence still has a long way to go, and I'm sure we'll be giving you some updates at some point. So on health, women are no longer in safe hands. 3 years ago, one of the largest NHS boards, National Health Service boards in Scotland, admitted that it can't guarantee a female healthcare practitioner if one is requested. And many other boards are now doing the same. And female wards increasingly also have men in them. In schools, many local authorities are converting toilets to be mixed sex, often with just a very small number of single-sex cubicles. Often the mixed-sex toilets don't even have floor-to-ceiling dividers, and they almost never include a sink in the cubicle. And this is causing girls in schools quite considerable problems. One local authority actually responded to the outcry about this by agreeing that the 3 toilet blocks should be designated one each for girls, boys, and mixed sex, but very few authorities seem to be willing to go down that route. Also, the Scottish Government has just introduced new transgender guidance to schools, which encourages teachers to unquestioningly accept a child's statement that they're a different gender. Amongst other things, the guidance states, being transgender is not a child protection issue or a well-being concern in itself. And it also says it's best not to share information with parents or carers without considering and respecting the young person's views and rights. In other words, pupils can prevent their teachers from sharing information appropriately. One of the main teaching unions has expressed considerable concerns about this, including that it ignores safeguarding issues and has no legal sound basis, which may leave teachers open to legal challenge, complaints of poor practice, and possible deregulation, which would mean the loss of their career. They've called for the guidance to be withdrawn meantime, and in fact that union is having its conference this weekend, and there was a motion to this effect. I just heard that the motion's been withdrawn because the Scottish Government was sufficiently concerned by the publicity about this case, that they've agreed to talk to the union about it. Whether the motion being withdrawn or not is a good thing remains to be seen. I think it'll depend on the outcome of these discussions with the Scottish Government. So again, watch this space. Academic freedom is under attack, just like it is in many other places. I don't think I need to say very much about that, along with freedom of expression and freedom of association. So really, there's absolutely no area of public life that hasn't been affected by gender ideology, with sometimes very severe consequences for women and girls and for women's rights. So I'd like to be able to end with some good news, although that's quite difficult to find in Scotland at the moment. As I already mentioned, although there's a long way to go, we are at least starting to have some small wins. Secondly, the gender ideologists may turn out to be our best friends because they're now so overreaching themselves that more and more of the general public are starting to notice and object, which I think will have a very big impact, because until recently, very, very few women knew what was, or people in general, knew what was going on. And lastly, women's rights organizations keep springing up, tackling a range of different issues and in different locations. So whilst we might have one of the worst governments, we do have some of the most fun campaigns. And we've got news for the gender extremists. Women's rights in Scotland were hard won and are not up for grabs. Anyone who thinks otherwise should remember that women won't be wishing anytime soon.